Barriers experienced by the deaf and hard of hearing population when accessing counselling services. Hearing loss can occur from birth due to illness, accident or ageing, etc. In developed countries, around 95% of children who are born with a hearing impairment have hearing parents. The deaf community is a diverse group that can be defined differently depending on how the individual perceives it. So, deaf people who use a capital D define their disability culturally rather than audiological. So they consider the use of sign language an indication of deaf-positive cultural identity instead of a disability. Therefore, those who use a lowercase d have acquired hearing loss or prefer to communicate using spoken language. So the deaf and hard of hearing population can sometimes then be divided into subgroups, such as severity, age of onset, cultural identity, and linguistics. In the UK, British Sign Language was established as a minority language in 2003, so it means it carries cultural norms, traditions and practices. It's the primary language used within the deaf population, and it uses body language, head movements and facial expressions as the foundation for the grammar structure that creates it. Mental health can commonly be quite poor within the deaf and hard of hearing population, and it can be due to a number of factors. For example, there is a lack of BSL signs for medical terminology. Individuals can be more susceptible to barriers when trying to access health services, and it can often be down to poor written, spoken or sign language skills. Deafness can often override other problems like autism and learning disabilities, where the attributes may be blamed on the hearing impairment instead. And common mental health problems identified within the deaf and hard of hearing population are anxiety disorder, behavioural problems and poor self-esteem. One study that looked at 523 participants with severe hearing loss found that before the age of 3, 32.4% of female participants showed signs of mental health distress, whereas 27% of males found signs of mental health distress. After the age of 3, 43% of females that lost their hearing showed signs of mental distress, whereas again 27% of males only showed signs of distress. It is believed that most individuals with hearing impairments tend to seek counselling with the same problems as hearing people. They tend to have a greater prevalence of mental health problems that can be influenced by numerous psychosocial factors like social isolation, inaccessibility to services, and poor socio-economic status. The general services offered for deaf and hard of hearing populations in relation to counselling is psychotherapy, but these tend to be limited to geographics, which in past research has found that this can cause delayed diagnosis and a poor self-awareness in relation to their own mental health. So the aim of this study was to explore what recommendations deaf and hard of hearing individuals make for counselling services in order to improve their access and reduce their barriers to counselling. They also wanted to look at the barriers in general that are identified by these participants, and the study hypothesised that participants who receive a BSL counsellor will be more satisfied with the counselling process than those who received other forms of communication. So the target population was deaf or hard of hearing individuals based in the UK. They were aged 18 years and above, and they were excluded if they were under 18 or did not have a hearing impairment. The study involved an opportunity sampling method where participants would respond to a social media post on either the researcher's Facebook page or through an advertisement on Bangor University School of Psychology Student Participant Panel, otherwise known as SONA. Those who signed up to SONA were rewarded 1 credit for their participation. The sample consisted of 16 females and 3 males. The age range was between 19 and 91, and the average age of participants was 41 years old. The majority of the ethnic sample were white British, 10% were Asian, and then two participants chose prefer not to say. 7 participants identified themselves as hard of hearing, 7 identified themselves as deaf, so with a capital D, so they defined their disability culturally. Then 3 participants identified themselves as deaf with a lowercase d, So these are those who have acquired hearing loss or prefer to communicate using spoken language. One participant chose not to say and another chose other. Participants who chose not to say in the demographic questions were not ruled out of the sample as long as they gave detailed explanations about their counselling experience and their hearing impairment. So within the sample, the participants that took part, the 19, these were the type of hearing losses that they had. So 3 had conductive hearing, the largest amount had mixed hearing loss, 3 had sensory neural, 1 preferred not to say, and 1 said other. So the study adopted a mixed methods approach. It collected both quantitative and qualitative data. It was an independent measures design where the independent variable was the type of communication, so the BSL counsellor, and the dependent variable was the level of satisfaction reported with the counselling process. The qualitative data was collected through the open questions and the quantitative through the closed. This allowed participants to give further explanations to certain questions, and then the qualitative data was analysed through an informal semantic analysis. The procedure involved participants accessing the online questionnaire via a link on Facebook or through a Sona advertisement. They had to give their consent before they can continue with the study, and then there was questionnaires asking them about their demographics such as their age, ethnicity, their hearing impairment and their preferred mode of communication. Part 1 of the questionnaire contained questions asking them about their access to support services, and then Part 2 of the questionnaire, which was used for this study, asked questions about accessing counselling and their experiences with barriers with the service. The questionnaire took a total of 30 minutes and it contained a number of open and closed questions. For example, do you believe it would be beneficial to have a deaf or hard of hearing counsellor instead of a hearing one? And then what mode of communication did you and your counsellor use during your counselling sessions? Once participants had completed the questionnaire, they were debriefed. So the study contained a number of ethical considerations, so we had to adhere to the ethical guidelines for research and practice, which were outlined by the BACP and BPS. We had to gain approval from the Bangor University School of Psychology's Research, Ethics and Governance Committee. We allowed participants the right to withdraw at any point during the study and the right to not answer any questions. We also had to gain consent before they could continue with the study, and if consent was not given, they were re-asked to give it. They were also debriefed and they were made aware of any potential risks and offered extra support services if needed. So once the dataset was downloaded, it was analysed and removed of participant emails and stripped of any irrelevant data. This resulted in 19 participants being used for the study, and 3 had to be removed due to incompleting the study. Of these 19 participants, 68% of the participants answered yes to having access counselling services before, and of the 68% who answered yes, 2 were male and 11 were female. 5 participants, 26%, stated they had never accessed counselling services before, and 6% chose not to say. The researchers hypothesised that individuals who were assigned a fully signing counsellor would be more satisfied with the counselling process than those who used other modes of communication. However, from the sample collected, not one of the participants reported having access to a BSL counsellor before. So a comparison was made between the preferred mode of communication used during the counselling service and the level of satisfaction they reported. Only one participant who had access counselling had not received their preferred mode of communication. So from the 12 participants who did receive their preferred mode of communication, the level of satisfaction reported varied. So no participants reported feeling dissatisfied, but 2 reported being very dissatisfied. 4 participants reported feeling neutral and 5 reported feeling satisfied. However, the results collected here could dispute the researchers' hypothesis because a large percentage of the participants who received their preferred mode of communication reported feeling neutral or satisfied with the therapeutic outcome, whereas only 2 participants reported being very dissatisfied, and from those those two participants who reported feeling very dissatisfied, earlier in the study they had reported that the barriers they had experienced when accessing counselling services were that they were not able to hear, and so this could have potentially been a confounding variable that influenced their answers. Participants were also asked whether they thought it would be beneficial to receive a BSL counsellor. These are the responses. So 52% of the overall participants stated yes, they would feel it would be beneficial to receive a BSL counsellor over a hearing one. So a follow-up question asked participants to further explain why they felt it would be beneficial to have a deaf counsellor over a hearing one. The main theme identified between all participants' answers was that a hearing counsellor may not have as much awareness as a deaf counsellor. 52% of participants had preference for a deaf or hard of hearing counsellor because they felt they could express understanding towards their situation. Participants were then also asked whether they were aware that they could receive a BSL counsellor. 58% answered yes, they were aware, but the remaining 42% answered no, they were not aware that they could receive a BSL counsellor. Participants were then asked if they could give a brief explanation of the barriers experienced when accessing counselling services. The main theme found within all answers was a relation to communication. So this was broken down into communication barriers and flexibility or adaptability of the service. These two main themes were then split into subordinate themes. So within communication barriers, the first subordinate theme was a lack of understanding. One participant explained how there was a lack of understanding between them and the counsellor that led them to feeling anxious and frustrated. The second subordinate theme was not being able to hear. 3 participants explained how they were not able to hear their counsellor, but didn't give further explanation as to why. The second subordinate theme was flexibility or adaptability within the counselling service. Participants described examples of the service not adapting to meet their needs. And the first subordinate theme was COVID. So the recent pandemic was a noticeable subordinate theme that participants identified as causing a barrier. So a lot of answers were in relation to inappropriate or unhelpful forms of communication or technology used. The second subordinate theme was refusal. So participants explained how they were denied access to a service or they were continuously signposted, and another explained how their service dog was denied access to the counselling room. So participants were asked what recommendations they would make to make counselling services more inclusive. So their recommendations tended to steer towards cultural sensitivity and awareness. So for example, counsellors learning BSL, or counsellors supporting and talking to you and getting you to join clubs. More people being aware of the variety of hearing issues, or knowing that they have to talk louder or clearer, or have more opportunities and more access. So the results identified a common theme that counselling services tended not to meet the participants' needs, and they expressed a potential for counselling services to focus on becoming more flexible. Multiple participants' answers steered towards educating counsellors about hearing impairment to allow for services to become more culturally aware. The answers also showed themes of communication being one of the biggest barriers. The study failed to directly answer the research hypothesis, which was participants who received a BSL counsellor would be more satisfied with the counselling process than those who received other modes of communication. However, the results suggest that as long as the participant received their preferred mode of communication, they were less likely to be dissatisfied with the counselling process. So our results support previous findings in relation to communication being a big barrier experienced by the deaf and hard of hearing population. A further study that argued cultural sensitivity and inclusivity could be achieved if a counsellor allowed the client to use their preferred mode of communication during the counselling process. However, our results suggested that 52% still stated they would prefer a BSL counsellor over a hearing one because of cultural awareness. I believe that the recent pandemic has had an effect on our results, but because we didn't ask participants when they accessed counselling and only a small number mentioned COVID-19, we can't assume this from all our results. I think a longitudinal study, if this was to be repeated, would allow researchers to gain more participants. So in the 3-month period that our study was active, the initial sign-up was quite slow. And it would also be interesting to see from a longitudinal study whether participants from different areas experience more barriers than others. As previous research has stated, counselling services tend to be limited to geographics. I'd also recommend a longitudinal study with stronger advertisement, as we only use Facebook and Sona, whereas if you can access advertisement through other counselling services or deaf and hard of hearing charities, I think it would allow you to gain more participants. One of the issues that we identified within our study was the potential for confounding variables. So we hadn't considered this in relation to the question that asked participants their level of satisfaction when using the counselling services. It's an issue that could have been removed if we'd asked if the level of satisfaction reported was linked to the communication during the counselling process or another factor. Alternatively, we could have asked a follow-up question that asked them the reason for scoring the level of satisfaction they did. It's an issue because by only asking the participants the level of satisfaction as a whole, there are other factors that could have influenced this that we may not have considered or controlled for. I also feel a pilot study could have been beneficial. So if this study was to be repeated, I'd recommend a pilot study to look for the potential errors in analysing the data. I'd recommend for future research that they use multiple platforms to allow these participants to answer through their preferred mode of communication. I think this would remove barriers to trying to access the study. I think it would be quite useful to look at the views of therapists in relation to what they're aware of and what potential barriers they're aware of when these types of individuals are trying to access their services. I also think future research investigating the types of counselling services available and how they're adapted for the deaf and hard of hearing population could be quite useful, as only previous research has mentioned psychotherapy. Thank you for listening.